Hello. This is a recreation of a presentation that I gave at Sussex University as part of their Pragmatics and Literature study day on the 22nd of February 2019. This presentation assumes a familiarity with the basic ideas of relevance theory. However, the general discussion should, I hope, be clear and accessible even if you are fairly new to pragmatics and fairly new to relevance theory. Okay, before I get into the main aims and into the main ideas that I want to present and discuss, I want to cover a few preliminary points to provide some context for the discussion. First, I want to consider a key assumption about the approach that I'm taking. So that's a key assumption about the relevance theoretic approach to utterance interpretation. And this is then going to lead me on to a question that has been raised by those working within relevance theory who are interested in how the ideas of relevance theory can be applied to the analysis of literary discourse. So first, the assumption. According to Wilson, 2011, the interpretation of literary work draws on the same basic cognitive and communicative abilities that are used in ordinary face-to-face exchanges. Now, this is an important assumption because when we approach the analysis of literary text, we need to keep this broader perspective on communication in mind. The idea here is that we don't use a different part of our brain or a different cognitive system to process communication and language that we experience in a literary context. We have the same brains, we have the same cognitive functions. So when we come to approach the analysis of literary text from a pragmatic perspective, we need to do so in a way that fits within this broader, more general approach to understanding communication. For the purpose of this discussion, that approach is the relevance theoretic pragmatic framework. Now, the fact that we are making this assumption leads us on to a key question that needs to be addressed when we think about literary works. According to relevance theory, something is relevant when it provides us with cognitive effects. And cognitive effects result when we take a piece of information, accept that piece of information as true, and then update our assumptions about the world on the basis of that information. So the question is, when we are dealing with fiction, with literary fiction, which is not true, how can processing an input that we know to be untrue, that we know to be fictional, how can that cause us to update our assumptions? And how can it therefore have a positive cognitive effect? So as Deirdre Wilson puts it, how exactly can a work of fiction be relevant to an audience? What type of positive cognitive effects can it achieve? So that's one of the questions that I'm going to be trying to answer today, or at least move towards an answer for this. And I'm going to be trying to do that while maintaining this first assumption, this assumption that we process literary works in the same way that we process other communicative acts. Okay, so that brings me on to my main aims for this talk. I'm going to be considering how ideas and distinctions from within the relevance theoretic approach to utterance interpretation might provide insights into the interpretation of literary texts generally and dramatic performances in particular. Most of the examples that I'm going to be discussing in this talk are theatrical, so they are plays that have been staged in the theatre. But the ideas that I'm discussing here could also apply to movies and television dramas. I'm going to introduce three key and interrelated distinctions in order to do this. I'm going to start by talking about the distinction between lower and higher level ostensive acts of communication. This is then going to bring me on to a distinction between internal and external relevance, and we'll be focusing mostly on external relevance in this talk. Then finally, I'm going to briefly touch on the distinction between what it means to comprehend something, an input, an utterance, and what it means to interpret that same utterance. So we'll finish with a discussion of the distinction between comprehension and interpretation. Okay, so on to the first of those distinctions, the distinction between lower and higher level ostensive acts, and particularly in relation to literary texts. As I said, I am in this talk going to be mainly drawing on theatrical, dramatic texts and performances, with a particular interest in how these ideas apply to these particular works. What happens when a play is performed? What happens when a playwright writes a play which is then performed for an audience? Well, the idea here is that when a play is performed in front of an audience, we have at least two sets of ostensive acts to consider. First of all, we have the set of ostensive acts that take place between the characters on the stage. So we witness characters communicating with other characters. And so those characters are performing ostensive acts of communication. They are producing utterances. They are communicating with other characters. And we as an audience have to interpret those play internal ostensive acts. And these play internal ostensive acts we're going to call the lower level ostensive acts. Now second, we have the ostensive act that takes place when a playwright, a producer, a set of actors and a creative team come together and perform that play. When they do this, they are in effect showing that play to an audience. Now, according to relevance theory, showing is an ostensive act of communication. And as an ostensive act of communication, it triggers the search for relevance in the same way that producing an utterance, an everyday utterance, triggers the search for relevance. So when an audience is told, come and watch this play, come and see this play, we want to show you this scene, this dialogue, this conversation, this action, this interaction, then the audience is entitled to expect that what they are shown, what they see, will be worth the effort they are putting into processing it. They are basically being asked to give the play their attention. And as such, they are being offered a promise, a guarantee that they will find it relevant. This, according to relevance theory and according to Sperber and Wilson, is the higher level act inherent in literary texts, and for the purposes of this talk, the higher level act that takes place when a play is performed. So let's look at these two acts in a little more detail. I'm going to start by briefly talking through the lower level act, and then I'll turn my attention more to the higher level act. So to start with, consider the following example. So this is an example taken from the play The Seagull by Anton Chekhov. In this example, we have the character Nina, who is sending a message to another character, Trigorin. And Nina is in love with Trigorin. So far in the play, we have seen that they have some romantic entanglement, but there are lots of other people, lots of other relationships that are also involved in the situation. Both have other love interests, and we don't completely know what is going on between these two. Now Nina sends Trigorin the message given in 1 on the slide. She sends him this message: "If ever you have need of my life, then come and take it." So this is a communicative act between Nina and Trigorin. And to interpret Nina's utterance, to understand what she is communicating, we have to perform several inferential, that is, pragmatic tasks. We have to assign reference to the pronouns that are used in this utterance. So we have to decide who it, you and my refer to. And then once we've done this, and assuming that we take it to be referring to my life, so in other words that she is saying, if ever you have need of my life, then come and take my life, then we have to then disambiguate between the two possible meanings of take my life. So does Nina just mean, if you have need of my life, come here and be part of my life, join with me, come and take part in my life? Or could it be that she is using the phrase take my life in a different sense, the sense of to kill me? That is Nina telling Trigorin here that she is willing to die for him, that her love is such that if he needed her to die for him, she would do that for him? So we have to disambiguate between these two possible meanings. Now, I think it's worth saying that for now, we're going to leave aside the really interesting idea that playwrights sometimes might make these kind of utterances deliberately ambiguous, and that this ambiguity might achieve its own effects. We'll leave that aside for a moment. That's another talk, another piece of research. However, for now, we just want to focus on really trying to work out what is Nina intending to communicate. So how do we go about doing that? How do we perform these inferential tasks? Well, Nina, remember, is performing an ostensive act, and so we can assume that she is intending her utterance to be optimally relevant. And we can use this assumption of optimal relevance to help guide our interpretation. However, we are not the addressees of her ostensive act. She's not talking to us as an audience, she's talking to Trigorin. And so we, as an audience, we cannot assume that her utterance will be optimally relevant for us. Trigorin is the addressee. So we can only assume that it will be optimally relevant for him. And so in order for us to derive her intended meaning, in order to work out the internal relevance of her utterance, we have to put ourselves into his mental shoes. When we interpret Nina's utterance, we are, in a sense, eavesdroppers on her conversation. We are eavesdroppers on these lower level acts that are taking place within the play and within the world of the play. Okay, so moving on to the higher level acts. And here on the slide we have the playwright, Chekhov, the writer of the words that we have just seen Nina speak. Now, in this higher level act, the playwright has chosen to show the audience this particular interaction, these particular lines, these particular words. He has decided that this scene is going to be part of the play, that this scene is going to be part of what is shown to the audience. And this act of showing raises its own expectations of optimal relevance. However, now the expectations of relevance are the expectations of the audience members. Now we, as an audience, are entitled to look for optimal relevance in the fact that we have been shown a particular scene. Now, one of my reasons for choosing Chekhov as my example here is that there is a theatrical and dramatic device known as Chekhov's gun. And Chekhov's gun is, in a way, derived, I think, from this intuition that when you show something to an audience, they will be looking for its relevance. But obviously, when Chekhov spoke about his gun, this was before relevance theory, and so there wasn't a way to formalize it in the way that relevance theory offers us. But I wanted to just include two quotations here from Chekhov which sum up this idea. So the first one is an extract from a letter. So Chekhov was writing to a fellow writer in 1889, and he says the following. He says, "One must never place a loaded rifle on the stage if it isn't going to go off. It's wrong to make promises you don't mean to keep." It's perhaps worth noticing here that when Chekhov said this, he was actually using it as a metaphor, and he was actually making a point about a monologue from a play that he deemed superfluous and unrelated to the rest of the action, to the rest of the play. So he was using the gun as a metaphor to say, don't show the audience things they don't need to know and that won't be worth their while. The second quotation is from a biography of Chekhov, and it is the author of the biography reminiscing and paraphrasing what Chekhov said, the advice that Chekhov gave him. And it is as follows. He says, "If in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Otherwise, don't put it there." So this is again that idea that if you show something, if you draw the audience's attention to something, then they are going to expect to find some kind of relevance in that, some kind of relevance in the fact that it has been shown to them. They are going to expect some kind of payoff for the attention that they have invested in that object or that event or that monologue or that discourse. Now again, there are interesting things perhaps to be said about cases where dramas and playwrights and writers might choose to deliberately distract us in some way, maybe take us down a garden path and make us focus on something that doesn't in fact turn out to be relevant in the end. But again, that probably leads to a different range of effects, and that's a topic for another talk. Okay, so we have these higher level and lower level ostensive acts. And this brings me on to the question of how these ostensive acts achieve relevance for the audience. So they trigger a search for relevance, an expectation that there will be optimally relevant things for the audience to derive. But how are these expectations of relevance satisfied? Well, here we're going to draw on the second key distinction in this discussion, the distinction between internal and external relevance. So what do we mean by that? Let's start with internal relevance. Something is internally relevant when it causes us to update our assumptions about something within the world of the play. So, for example, Nina's message to Trigorin reveals to us the extent of her feelings for him. And this causes us to update our assumptions about the characters, about Nina and about Trigorin, and we will probably also update our assumptions about their relationship to one another. It might change how we interpret the future events that we witness in the play. It might well change our perception of what has gone on within the play and what is going on within the play, both in that scene and in future scenes. Now, the other way in which these ostensive acts might achieve relevance is that they might be relevant externally. That is, they may cause us to update our assumptions about the actual world. So not the world of the play, but the actual world in which we live. So, for example, the tone and content of Nina's message to Trigorin might make us reflect on our own lives, our own relationships, the nature of love more generally. We may ask ourselves, do we love as passionately as Nina does? Have we ever felt the way that she does? What does that tell us about our own lives, about our own experiences? So the fact that this utterance has been shown to us in this way might achieve relevance in this particular way. It might make us reflect or change our ideas about the real world. And indeed, this was certainly the case for me when I first saw a production of The Seagull at the Royal Shakespeare Company when I was an impressionable 15-year-old. I certainly reflected on my assumptions and expectations and hopes and dreams about love and life. Here's what Deirdre Wilson has to say about these notions of internal and external relevance. So, internal relevance, she says, expectations of internal relevance arise in the context of the preceding text and guide the interpretation of the subsequent text. Then she moves on to talk about external relevance, and she says many literary works achieve what might be called external relevance by having lasting cognitive effects on beliefs and assumptions about the world. So they make us reflect and perhaps change our ideas about the real world. So let's think a little bit more about this idea of external relevance. The picture on this slide is an image from a recent production of the Threepenny Opera by Brecht. And I chose this because in this play, Brecht shows us scenes which depict a cutthroat world. They depict morally suspect characters, and we are encouraged to reflect on that world, on those characters, and on society more generally. The scenes that we are shown might, for example, cause us to think about the virtues or otherwise of living in a capitalist society. And Wilson, discussing external relevance, makes this further point. She says that the external relevance of fictional events is less likely to be achieved via an updating of facts and more likely to be derived by encouraging the audience to make connections, to set up new inferential routines, or by contributing to the communication of an impression. That is, external relevance is less often about learning hard and fast facts about the world and more often about changing our perspective on the world, making us think about something in a different way. Very much in the way that Brecht was trying to make people think about society in a different way. So in this sense, external relevance is likely to be found via the derivation of weakly communicated and indeterminate propositions. And it is this focus on external relevance that allows literary works and plays in particular to endure across time, across cultures, perhaps across distances. It's what makes it possible for a work to be successfully revived and reinterpreted, because even though the audience may know what's going on play internally, they may know what's going to happen in the plot of the play, and they may even know what each character is going to say, a director and the actors and the creative team involved in that particular play can use the words and actions of the characters to show different things to the audience. in a different production. They can encourage different impressions, different inferential connections. So, for example, while the lines in Hamlet might not have changed in 500 years, a new production of Hamlet can show those lines to an audience in a way that encourages them to draw new and different conclusions and encourages them to update their assumptions about the real world in a different way. So much of the relevance of a revival or a reinterpretation might come from external rather than internal relevance. So, for example, in a recent production of Hamlet at the Almeida Theatre in London, the director, presumably, and designers chose a contemporary setting for the play. And this involved showing the political manoeuvrings that go on between the different characters, depicted often as news coverage and 24-hour kind of rolling news broadcasts, and we kind of had the sense of maybe social media interaction taking place. Characters watched each other on CCTV cameras, for example. And when Hamlet, as pictured here, played by Andrew Scott, declares the time is out of joint, we are perhaps encouraged to think about how this line might apply to our own experiences of the world, to our contemporary society, how these notions of 24-hour news and social media coverage, how a world that's driven by that could perhaps be out of joint. Whether our own political and social circumstances are kind of appropriately discussed in this same way, and could perhaps he's commenting as much on that as he is on the kind of original world of the play. Now, the fact that the creative team have decided to show the scene to us in this way may suggest that they intended for us to draw these conclusions and to find this external relevance. However, each audience member will bring their own perspective and assumptions to the experience of the play. And so this external relevance, the way in which a literary work is externally relevant, is likely to be different for each consumer of that piece of literature. And this brings me on to the final distinction that I want to make. And I'll be just very briefly touching on this as another idea that relevance theory can contribute to our understanding of literary texts. And that is the distinction between comprehension and interpretation. So what do I mean by this? Well, again, I'm going to draw on the words of Deirdre Wilson. And according to her, comprehension is the process of recognizing the intended import of an ostensive act, while interpretation includes the broader process of drawing one's own conclusions as part of the overall search for relevance. So while a playwright may write the scene in a particular way, and the actors and directors may show us a scene in a particular way, they can't be responsible for every possible interpretation that may arise. They can't know what assumptions and experiences each audience member will bring to their viewing of the play, and each audience member may find relevance in a slightly different way. And so this is where we go beyond comprehension and we move into interpretation. So, as Wilson goes on to say, as communication becomes weaker, comprehension shades off into interpretation. The borderline between authorial intentions and unintended implications becomes increasingly blurred. So, when we have much of the relevance of a play being this external relevance, then we're going to find some of that being interpretation, and therefore less under the control of the playwright, the authors, the creatives, than it would be if it were just comprehension, which is tied much more tightly to the intentions of the writer, the playwright, the director, the creatives. So, to sum up my points, an act of producing and performing a play is an act of showing, and as such, it is a higher level act of ostensive communication which triggers an expectation of relevance. These expectations of relevance may be satisfied externally if the audience members update their assumptions about the real world in some way. In some cases, the audience member may go beyond comprehension into the realms of interpretation and draw some conclusions that the playwright, director, actors need not necessarily either anticipate or, in fact, endorse. And this brings me on to my very last example that I want to show you. And this is an example to illustrate how interpretation can indeed go beyond what an author, a playwright, intended. So last Christmas, Christmas 2018, there was a new television adaptation of Watership Down. And this is a screenshot from an article in the Guardian newspaper about the original novel and about the adaptation. So the headline reads, "True meaning of Watership Down revealed ahead of TV revival." So what is this true meaning, you might ask? How are we to take this story about rabbits and interpret it? What did the author intend to communicate to us by showing us this story about rabbits? Well, if you read the subheading on the article, all is revealed. It says, "Readers thought story was cryptic allegory, but its creator was firm. It's just a story about rabbits." And I will leave you with that thought. Here are some references which I've either used in this presentation or which pick up on similar ideas and might be useful for further reading and further research. Thank you very much.